I'm JG Michael, and this is Parallax Views. This edition of Parallax Views is brought to you by the $10 and above tier supporters of Parallax Views on Patreon. So, with that in mind, producers credit shoutouts to Galen, Matt, Gunnar, Mark, Simon, Alexander, Catherine, G, Tilo, Emilia, Jeremy, Jeff, John, Bert, Brian, Elliot, Michael, Brace, James, Nick, Mersham, Galen, Gareth, Arlen, Bo, Christopher, Michael, Gigadelic Media, Will, Chance, Chase, Dan, Big Bob, David H, Y. Kellerman, Sadeed 13, Kathleen, David, Ava, Bob, The West Bank Robbery Podcast, Jamie, Enoch, Gary, Max, Ishtofer, James, Martin, Matthew Ho, Brian, Nobody, Thomas, and Dano. And now on to the show. Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. As always, before we begin this edition of the program, I'd like to remind you that I am currently without any sponsors or advertisers, so it is you, the listener, that will ensure that this show keeps going. Help keep us afloat by donating to Parallax Views at Patreon. Patreon.com/ParallaxViews. If you'd like to make a donation, that's how you can do so. And with that out of the way, we have Antiwar.com's news editor, Dave DeCamp, returning to discuss the latest foreign policy news with a particular focus on Donald Trump's appointment of Michael Dimino to head up Middle East policy at the Pentagon. A very interesting pick, and you'll find out why in the conversation to follow. With that being said, let's get right to it with Dave DeCamp. Welcome back to Parallax Views, the news editor for Antiwar.com, Dave DeCamp, and we've got quite a few interesting stories coming out, don't we, Dave?
Yeah, we sure do. Thanks again for having me, JG.
So the first story I wanted to cover with you, and the reason I got in touch with you, was this new appointment to head Middle East policy that Trump has made. Can you tell us a little bit about this guy and how this has caused some controversy, especially with right-wing pro-Israel publications like JNS and Jewish Insider?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is interesting. So this guy, Michael Dimino, he's a former CIA analyst. And I've been aware of him for about the past year. And he was with Defense Priorities, which is one of the better think tanks in DC. For Antiwar.com, we run a lot of stuff from the people who work there. Daniel Davis, Daniel DePetris, a few guys over there who are really good.
So they're a realism and restraint sort of think tank.
Yeah. And I followed Michael Dimino, who was in this appointment, on Twitter. He followed me. And I mean, I remember like he engaged with me. I don't want to blow up his spot or anything, but he deleted all of his Twitter history, which was probably a good move. But, you know, he was really, I thought he was really good. His analysis, I particularly paid attention to what he had to say about the situation in Syria and Iraq with U.S. troops coming under attack, the new bombing campaign in Yemen. He said, it was foolish, and he was completely vindicated by that. So I remembered him, and then I really had no idea who was, in the running for any kind of position. And then I saw this story. What was it? It was Jewish Insider, right?
Jewish Insider reported on it, and also JNS, which is another very right-wing publication. They seem very angry about this.
Yeah. So that's the first time I saw it. Like I realized he was appointed in this position was, basically the story is pro-Israel Republicans are concerned about this appointment. And a few things they cited, what he's been saying for the past year. Basically, one webinar that they cited that he did, he was asked, does the U.S. have any interest in the Middle East these days? And he said basically no. Like there's essentially We have no real interest, and he favors withdrawing troops, especially from these places like Iraq and Syria, where they're really vulnerable to attack.
Yeah,
And he
and real
also,
quick, not to interrupt you, but I want to use the exact quote here. He said that vital or existential U.S. interests in the Middle East are best characterized as minimal to non-existent. I mean,
yeah,
yeah, but go on.
yeah. So this is the guy in charge of Middle East policy at the Pentagon now. So I think it's a good sign. But we can get more into that. But just more about him and what they're upset about. Other things that he said, I mentioned Yemen. And he wrote this really good piece for Responsible Statecraft in January 2024, just a few weeks after Biden started this new bombing campaign against the Houthis in response to their attacks on Israeli shipping. And essentially, what he said was that the solution to this is not this military action. It's not going to go well for the U.S. He said the U.S. should think about actually putting pressure on Israel to improve the situation in Gaza because that is the root cause of these attacks. And now we see with this Gaza ceasefire that the attacks have stopped. And there's been some threats. They're essentially saying that they're going to monitor the ceasefire and make sure that Israel follows the ceasefire, or else they could restart the attack. So, and that was the thing all along. Instead of pressuring Israel to reach a ceasefire, Biden bombed Yemen for over a year. And it did nothing. It only escalated the situation. Anybody who really knew anything about Yemen, about the Houthis, knew that it wasn't going to stop them. If anything, it was going to embolden them even more. They're kind of trying to make a name for themselves as the only ones who are sticking up for the Palestinians. So the whole thing was foolish, and he knew that, and he called it out. So it's good to see him in this position, I think. On the other hand, you have this guy, Pete Hegseth. It looks like, I think he was just confirmed by the Senate. And he's tough. It's tough to make out what he's going to be like. He was a Fox News host, pundit. And so he said all sorts of crazy, horrible things over the years. But he's also, I don't know, said some good things. It's hard for me to have any real, have my hopes up for him. But at the same time, he would never be in this position if not for Trump. So I think if Trump does want to, I think he's going to do what Trump wants. And if Trump does want to scale down in the Middle East and end these wars and keep the regional calm that's come as a result of this Gaza ceasefire, I think he'll carry it out.
Now, we should also get into this. What's the latest on the ceasefire? And I think Trump has said something very telling in that he doesn't even know if it's going to hold. That yeah. Do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, so that was concerning. That was I think Monday night. He was asked, "Do you think the Gaza ceasefire will hold?" And he says, "I'm not confident. I'm not confident at all." He said it's not our war, which isn't really the case because the U.S. gives Israel all the weapons that they need for that. Um, but on the other hand, he has this guy Steve Witkoff, who is his Middle East envoy. Who, I mean, it's really amazing, that it was this one meeting. This is according to the Arab mediators who have been working on these negotiations for a year. This guy, Steve Witkoff, who's a real estate investor from New York, he goes over to Israel and basically makes Netanyahu agree to a deal. We don't really know exactly what kind of pressure he put on him. I think there's a chance that he promised to back them in these West Bank escalations that we're seeing. But he got Netanyahu to agree, and he's going around, saying that he's committed to making sure that this ceasefire lasts. That there's all these different phases, but you have Netanyahu saying that he got a guarantee from Trump that he can restart the war if he wants after the first phase. The first phase is a 42-day ceasefire and hostage exchange during that time. So it's very shaky. And we've seen a few Palestinians get killed specifically in the south, in Rafah. There's been like 5 or 6 Palestinians killed by the IDF. But again, this guy Witkoff seems pretty determined. So hopefully, and I'm starting to see Republicans, Iran hawks and stuff complain about him. I just wrote a thing. He's apparently going to be put in charge of negotiations with Iran.
I wanted to ask you about that next. Yes.
Yeah. So that's another good sign because Trump fired this guy, Brian Hook. Brian Hook was Trump's Iran guy in the last administration who oversaw what they called the maximum pressure campaign. And the maximum pressure was Trump quitting the Iran nuclear deal, reimposing sanctions on Iran. And that also involved the assassination of the Iranian general Qasem Soleimani, the head of the Quds Force. And so Brian Hook was put in charge of filling out the State Department in the transition line. And we saw all sorts of reports over the last few weeks saying that the Trump administration, they're going to consider, direct military action against Iran. And but now we see Brian Hook fired and Witkoff being put in charge. I think that is a good sign. At the same time, the administration is stacked with Iran hawks. I mean, everybody pretty much, Marco Rubio, what's his name? The National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz. We'll see how.
Dave, are you still with me?
Yeah, I am. Did I lose you there?
Yeah, I lost you for a second. So I'll edit that. But you said you were saying Mike Waltz, and then
Oh yeah, I was just saying. So you have these Iran hawks in the administration that are going to resist any kind of push towards some kind of nuclear deal. But I still think Witkoff being put in that role. It seems like Trump is saying, "All right, let's see what you can do with this now." So Witkoff is still going to be focused on the Gaza stuff. Apparently, he's visiting Gaza soon. But
he also didn't he say it was good that Hamas wants to talk with the U.S.?
yeah, and I thought that was interesting. I mean, you compare kind of what he's saying, just compare it to, like, the Republicans are just completely hysterical. You talk about Hamas or anything like this, they just start throwing words out there, like they're a terrorist organization. We should never talk to them or anything is kind of their position. But a Hamas official said that they want talks with the U.S. to work out all these issues. And he was asked about that. And he said, well, it's good if it's true. So
Okay.
it shows, it does kind of show, I think you have kind of an outsider, a guy who, he hasn't been in the government before, coming in and going against kind of the norms here. I mean, you had Brett McGurk, who was Biden's Middle East guy, working on this ceasefire deal. He's like 20 years experience in the government, working on the Middle East, and he couldn't move the needle. So I don't know. This guy seems determined. I don't want to get too hopeful because this is one thing. The thing with Trump is like sometimes he sounds like he's going to do something good, and then he just does like the exact opposite. But I think it's like relative to how things have been over the past year under Biden. I think there's definitely improvements here.
Anything else people should know about Witkoff? And is there anything else from that article about him being in charge of Iran negotiations that we should know about?
Well, the big thing with Iran is that, they're back to kind of hyping up the idea that they're going to build a nuclear bomb, and it's based on their enrichment levels. And, they're enriching uranium at 60% purity, which they started doing a few years ago in response to like an Israeli sabotage attack. So it's really kind of the way Israel operates with this is they launch all these covert attacks inside Iran. And then over the years, Iran has responded by increasing its nuclear activity. They're essentially trying to increase their leverage with the U.S. for negotiations. But that's what everybody's now. There is still just no evidence that Iran wants a nuclear bomb. The conversation has changed in Iran, I will say. Members of the Iranian parliament, some of them are calling to rethink the prohibition on building a nuclear bomb. But as far as we know now, there's no evidence that they're actually going to do it. But if there is kind of a push from the Iran hawks, we might kind of start to see that some kind of propaganda campaign through the media. If they're going to try to derail any diplomacy from Iran, we might start to really kind of see that, I think, get whipped up, this idea of Iran building a bomb.
Now, if we could, you mentioned Brian Hook getting fired. There's also the news about John Bolton and his security clearance being, kiboshed by Trump. How important is this to note? Because I feel like he's potentially maybe sending a message to some of the Iran hawks in the party.
Yeah, I mean, with John Bolton, he lost his security clearance. He included him with these 51 intelligence officials that signed this letter that the Hunter Biden thing was Russian disinformation back in 2020. And then he threw John Bolton in there. I mean, I think with John Bolton, maybe it is a message to Iran hawks, but I think it's more personal because since Bolton left his administration,
I suspect that too, to be honest. But yeah.
Yeah, Bolton has just been on a tear against Trump ever since, he was out. They had their falling out or whatever. But I think the thing with Brian Hook, I think that's something. Trita Parsi from the Quincy Institute saying, he suspects that a lot of these leaks about what the Trump administration is going to do with Iran, they're going to consider military action, probably came from Brian Hook or his people, and maybe Trump wasn't happy about that. He seems to be pretty positive, Trita Parsi, who so that's a good sign, I think.
Should we also talk about Trump's recent designation of the Houthis as a foreign terrorist organization? How important is that right now?
Yeah, I mean, that actually is not the best sign because this is kind of like right now what we're seeing after the ceasefire in Gaza, we're seeing the calm, and then they kind of just throw this designation on the Houthis, which it's tough to know how much of a difference that makes. This is something the Trump administration put on it back in 2021. Then Biden lifted it. There's two different designations. It's foreign terrorist organization, and then specially designated global terrorists. They're pretty similar, but there are some differences. And the foreign terrorist organization, the one that Trump just reinstated, is the harsher one. It essentially criminalizes any transactions with the Houthis. So it criminalizes delivering aid to Houthi controlled areas of Yemen, which is where most Yemenis live. And they've been dealing with the hunger crisis for years there. So it could have an impact on that. But the Biden already put the other terror designation back on when he started the bombing campaign. So I don't know if it's going to really have that much impact. Um, but I think that's a bad sign that we might see some just kind of resorting to sanctions. This is like what the U.S. has done for the past few decades is just, oh, we want to solve something, let's just throw sanctions at it. And it doesn't do anything. It just hurts, ordinary people who are living there, especially with the Houthis. I mean, the war against them, the Saudi UAE war that the U.S. backed against them for so many years, really heavy bombing campaign, total blockade, ground campaign, so many civilians starving to death. But the Houthis were able to thrive and became more of a capable fighting force in that time. So throwing this terror designation, I mean, it's just like, what are they doing? Like, what's the point of that?
In regards to these terrorist designations and state sponsors of terror, we should talk about how Trump is dealing now with Cuba and also, let me see here. Uh, doesn't he also he's talking about Mexico again. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, that is something I'm actually really concerned about. He designated the Mexican cartels as foreign terrorist organizations. Actually, both of the, as far as I understand it, not all the details were in the executive order, but as far as I understand, it's both of those terror designations for the cartels and also MS-13 and then a Venezuelan gang. So the Cuba thing first, it's just so stupid that Cuba is still under this Cold War era embargo. And this is something that's really bad about having Marco Rubio as the Secretary of State. I mean, there's just absolutely no reason to keep them under those sanctions. So the terror designation, and it doesn't even make sense. The Cuba designation, what is it? They call them a state sponsor of terrorism. It's something Obama lifted and then Trump put back on, and then Biden just lifted like a week before Trump came in, and then they put it right back on. It basically just means Cuba's going to stay under the embargo, which is just a shame. Again, it's just so dumb. But and that's one thing with Marco Rubio. I mean, he's a real hawk when it comes to Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua. Um, and so the cartel thing. I mean, the idea of the U.S. taking military action against the cartels has become very popular in the Republican Party. There's even been legislation introduced to authorize the use of military force against the cartels. And Mike Waltz was a co-sponsor of that, who's now the national security advisor. Um, and this designation could be a first step in that direction. And there's also a chance that this could really actually increase migration to the U.S. because the cartels are like, intertwined with society in a lot of places in Mexico. So basically, these sanctions make it illegal to any transactions with them. So, people are forced to pay protection money and things. So if they're at risk, they could be at risk of being targeted by the U.S., I guess, with sanctions or something. So it could make more people want to flee the area or something. Um, I just think the whole thing's really foolish, but it could be a first step toward military action, which I think is just such a bad idea. I mean, people don't understand. I don't know enough about. I need to read up more on the cartels and everything, but people think that they're just like they would be easy. Oh, you could just send in some Green Berets and they take them all out, but they have sophisticated weapons. They control a lot of territory in Mexico. They probably have a bunch of people in the U.S. that could carry out attacks for them. Like if we went to war with them, I think it would bring a real war to American soil. They could fire rockets at, across the border. So I really hope that, and the idea is to stop the flow of fentanyl, which a lot of it comes in on planes. It's so small, like it's gonna stop the flow of it. Like most of the smugglers are Americans that come through the border. The whole thing is just really foolish, I think.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think a mutual friend of ours, I don't know if do you know Brandon Buck?
Yeah, yeah.
He's written a lot about this, and I suspect people should be reading his stuff on Mexico right now because he's very against the idea of a military intervention. And I've been sad to see, you know, well, sad but not surprised to see some people calling for this crazy idea of a military intervention into Mexico. I think it would go very badly, and I do see some elements of the Republican Party that are really gung-ho about that in ways that I think are dangerous.
Yeah, yeah. It's a shame because some people who are good on other conflicts, seem to be really into this idea. And again, a lot of them think it would be like so easy. But you mentioned Brandon Buck. That's what I was thinking of, like when I was saying that it would not be easy. He makes a lot of good points in his writing on it. Um, yeah, it's definitely a concern.
Do you want to talk? Because I know I haven't covered it at all, and I thought it was just bluster, but what about Trump talking about not rolling out military force to take the Panama Canal in Greenland?
Yeah, this whole
I
thing
like
that
how you laughed a bit there.
yeah, well, that's how I felt about it. Like during because he didn't start talking about it until after the election. So at first I just brushed it off, but then he did. If you remember that press conference at Mar-a-Lago, like a week before he was inaugurated, that's like what the whole thing was about. Was the Panama Canal, Greenland. He's saying he won't rule out using military force. So I was like, all right, I guess I got to start paying attention to this. The thing with the Panama Canal is that his whole gripe doesn't make any sense. He claims that China controls it, which there's just no truth to that. It's run by the Panama. They have a government authority that runs the canal.
Okay, so he's sort of pushing like a China conspiracy theory.
Yeah, if you remember on Christmas, he put out a tweet or a Truth Social post. He said, "Merry Christmas, especially to the Chinese soldiers in the Panama Canal" or something. And it's just like, what? So he claims China runs it. And then if you look at the claim, it pretty much just boils down to two of Panama's main ports. They have like six main ports near the canal, are managed by companies based in Hong Kong. And that's all it is. And, like people would be surprised. A lot of ports in the US are managed by foreign companies. So that doesn't mean that China controls the canal. And, he's also complaining about the fees. So, and relative to how much shipping the US, like, I mean, the fees aren't like crazy or anything. So I just don't really get what he's trying to do. It's like, is he trying to make some kind of deal? If he's trying to just make a deal with Panama, what is the deal? I really don't know. But Marco Rubio is going there. That's his first stop on a foreign trip as Secretary of State. So we'll see. But yeah, I mean, it just doesn't. That's the thing is, it just doesn't really make much sense. I think he might be trying to stop China's like infrastructure investments and stuff in Latin America. I'm sure that's something because his whole administration stacked with China hawks, and that's something they're all about. So it could be related to that. But I feel like these threats and everything is just going to push them closer to China.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to tell what Trump is going to do. He feels like a very erratic figure who will say a lot of things, and it's hard to know when he's being serious and when he's just saying something to say something. I mean, he even talked about absorbing Canada as a 51st state, I
Hmm.
think, recently.
Yeah, and then Greenland's the other one.
Yeah. I mean,
So I think there was a chance that he's just saying, like, kind of distracting people with this. Because again, that press conference, it was like all about it. it was like the biggest thing. He's up there just saying, "Oh, this is the incoming." Because again, I was kind of ignoring it for a while, but this is the incoming president of the United States saying that he could potentially use military force to take Greenland and the Panama Canal. So it just became all about that. So it's like maybe he just wants people distracted. I don't know. Because I think in a way, like Trump is so erratic, but I also think he's deliberate. Like I think he does things pretty deliberately.
It seems like he says certain things that are very outrageous to get people riled up, and then he never follows up on it, you know?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So it'll be an interesting couple of years. I remember because when I first started working for antiwar.com full time, it was 2020. It was like towards the end of the Trump administration. And I remember it's like you watch a Trump press conference and you're trying to cover it. We all just focus on foreign policy, but it's always hard to figure out like what even to like write about it. It's just like he's just so all over the place. But yeah, I think there's some good signs with the Middle East. I mean, again, relative to Biden, this was, these were areas where I thought Trump would be much worse, could be much worse than Biden, Gaza and Iran and stuff. But it turns out he's already been better. I mean, he's only been president for 3 days, but
I mean, to be
um,
fair, I mean, I'm still not completely sold on Trump with the Middle East. And, there's the issue with him being funded by Miriam Adelson. And also, I guess he's getting rid of those sanctions on the settlers. So I don't want to give the impression that we're out of the woods yet. 'Cause I don't know what he'll do
yeah,
with the Middle East. I think it's very much an open question at this point. I don't know if you'd agree, but
yeah. I agree because you see Witkoff, another thing that he talks about is, oh, we need normalization deals. We need Israel to normalize with Saudi Arabia and all the Arab states. And I mean, the way he was talking, it made it even sound like he was talking about Iran. But he didn't say that, but it just seemed like that's kind of what he meant because they said, "Oh, what countries do you think would get on board with with normalization with Israel?" And he said, "Everyone." He said, "I think everyone could do it." But the thing is, the glaring problem, and this is why the Abraham Accords, which were the normalization deals between Israel and Bahrain and the UAE, didn't actually bring peace to the region, is because they did not deal with the issue of the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and the blockade on Gaza. This is something that Mike Domino has said that it was foolish, and this is another thing he's getting attacked for, saying that it was foolish to sign those deals without giving anything to the Palestinians and with this, especially with this current Israeli government, but just in general, like the situation in the West Bank. I mean, how is that going to be resolved? Because you need that to be resolved really for there to be peace. And I just like have no answers really. Like realistically thinking about it, the settlers, there's like what 500,000 Israeli settlers in the West Bank. So I don't know. I mean, that's what really needs to be resolved, and just can't. I can't imagine this is the administration that's going to do it. And he lifted the sanctions on the West Bank settlers. Mike Huckabee's his ambassador to Israel, who's completely in favor of annexation and everything. So that I think is the big problem.
before we close out, and I know this is a bit of a speculative question, but when I heard about Domino, I was thinking about, and they're not necessarily comparable. I think they're from different worlds, but I think they've said some things that don't necessarily overlap, but you can tell they're trying to go in a different direction with Middle East policy. And I'm thinking about Phil Gordon, who was the foreign policy advisor for Harris. Uh, I guess what I'm getting at is I think there's this growing sort of sentiment in DC amongst various elements in the Beltway that we need to pivot away from the Middle East. I think that's been a talking point in a lot of circles since at least Obama. It's just that we never go through with it. Um, do you think a lot of this may have to do with wanting to pivot away from the Middle East to focus on other areas like China?
Yeah, yeah. So that's kind of maybe a negative aspect of some of this because so I don't know much about Domino. I've never seen him really say much about China. Um, and but another big figure here is Elbridge Colby, he's like number 3 at the Pentagon now. I forget his exact position, or he's been nominated for that. And this guy, he's coming under attack because he doesn't think war with Iran is a good idea. But his whole thing is we have to get ready for war with China over Taiwan. Like we have to put all our resources into it and commit to going to war with China over Taiwan, which I think like he's a total hawk, but he's kind of treated as this, realist, even though, when you get down to it, a lot of the realists are China hawks, but I mean him even more so. Like it's completely kind of hysterical in a way, his view. Although at the same time, he doesn't have one thing I appreciate about him. He's kind of an interesting character is that he's not like on a crusade. He's not like on a more like he's not a neocon in the sense that he's like, oh, he's attacking China for its system and everything. But he is just kind of openly saying, he calls it, he says the U.S. needs to form an anti-hegemonic coalition in Asia. And the hegemon he's worried about is China. Like he doesn't want China
this is similar to like the sort of John Mearsheimer type view of like, well, the conflict is inevitable, because of security and resources. Yeah.
Yeah, and he's like he doesn't want China to, move an inch in any direction. So it's like that is kind of an aspect of this. And that's even, the Biden administration, the Trump administration started this. They released the National Defense Strategy that said, we got to scale down in the Middle East, basically, and get ready for this great power competition. And Colby was actually a big part of that, crafting that NDS. And then the Biden administration, that was their whole thing too. I mean, they got out of Afghanistan and focused on Russia and Ukraine. And they've really gone through with a lot of building up of alliances and military bases in Asia, in the Asia Pacific, and all these new economic things against China. So that is kind of the I think the big
that's
picture.
why I mentioned, I think, like I said, they're not the same, but like Domino has been critical of U.S. Middle East policy. Phil Gordon maybe for different reasons, but they're both being critical. And I think you're seeing elements on both the sort of Democratic and the Republican side that are like, oh, we need to scale back on the Middle East. And sometimes I wonder if that's because they want to focus on China. So I think we're on the same page there, that could be a possible scenario we need to think about.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And it's something, that I'm trying to make a point to focus on because Marco Rubio, I mean, it's about as hawkish on China as you can get. So this is definitely an element of it. And, that's one thing I remember about the first Trump administration, him saying that he wanted to get out of the Middle East and everything. Thing is, though, if you're going to back Israel, be 100% on board with Israel and be an Iran hawk, then you're never going to get out of the Middle East. Especially, and that's been really shown now. But I mean, China, the way Trump's been talking about China, he spoke with Xi Jinping. He invited him to the inauguration. They actually sent an official, which that has like never happened before. He's been saying some good things about China, but at the same time, he's got all these China hawks. Like everyone's, even JD Vance is, he's a big China hawk. So that's kind of the thing, the future kind of down the line, the thing to look out for.
Well, I think we'll be talking a lot more in the next, 4 years and probably even beyond that with whoever gets in next. But I really want to thank you, Dave DeCamp, for coming on Parallax Views. And we'll have to do it again sometime. I'm sure we will because the news is coming in thick and fast.
Yeah, it sure is.
How can my listeners keep up with your work? Anything you want to plug here? I mean, everyone knows about antiwar.com. Is there anything else you're working on, or?
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty much it. All my writing is there at antiwar.com. Check out my show, Anti-War News with Dave DeCamp. It's on YouTube or Rumble, or you could listen to the podcast form, which is how most people do it. It's basically just kind of a daily update on the news that I cover. Then you can follow me on Twitter. And we're on TikTok now, antiwar.com. So go check us out there.
Well, that does it for this edition of Parallax Views. As always, if you can, please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. And with that being said, until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. It's nothing else. if we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.